Welcome to the book launch for Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. So the book I have here, just to wave it at you. Some of you have probably seen it. This is the hardback version. There's also a paperback and an ebook. It's published by Equinox, and you can purchase it on the Equinox site at a 25% discount if you wish. So that's probably the cheapest place to get hold of it. You can get the 25% discount by inputting ARCH in the when you check out. Okay, so the format I'm going to follow is I'm going to talk a bit about the book, try and give you a rough idea of some of the key ideas in it. But after that, there'll be time for questions and discussion. If you need to drop out at any point, then that's fine. That's up to you. But it will last a maximum of an hour and a half. If it comes to a natural end before then we'll finish then. Yeah. Okay, so welcome to everyone. I'll start with a little bit about myself, first of all. As some of you I know already, or know me already. Some of you don't. So I will say just a little bit about where I'm coming from. So this book is approximately my 20th book. I haven't been counting them very closely, but basically I've been working for some time on middle way philosophy, which is a practical approach to how we should live our lives, really, but particularly to judgment. It focuses particularly on how we make decisions, how we make judgments of all kinds. And I've been working on this for some 20 years. The middle way is central to this project, really. It's been a developing approach which synthesizes a number of disciplines. So I started off more in religious studies and philosophy, but along the way I've become very engaged in psychology and also things like systems theory, neuroscience, and embodied meaning. So all of those have become very important to my approach. And one of the things that has been very much part of middle way philosophy from the beginning, really, has been Jung and the insights that I found in Jung and archetypes. So this book is really, I suppose it's an approach to middle way philosophy, but from the point of view of archetypes. So it can stand by its own, it can stand on its own as a book about archetypes. So hopefully some of you may just read it from the standpoint of archetypes, because that's where you're coming from, what you're interested in. But it is also a potential way into a larger project, reflected in my other work. And the fact that middle way philosophy is practical has also been reflected in the fact that I founded the Middle Way Society, which is very much about encouraging people to practice the middle way as well as to understand it. Excuse me. Also, I'm in the process of developing a retreat centre in Wales. So again, middle way themed retreats will be a major part of what we do in this. This is where I am, Tywelyn House in Wales. Okay, so that's very briefly where I'm coming from. Obviously, if you want to ask anything else about those things, you can do so at the end of the talk. However, what I want to focus on now is archetypes, because I know many of you will have just come here to get an idea about my book and what it says. So I'm going to start off by sharing a few pictures, actually. So this is really just to set the scene. These pictures will be ones that are, well, often are archetypal symbols for people. Whether they are or not does depend on you, not just on the picture itself, but I think it's fair to assume that they all will be. Okay, so yeah, first picture then. Actually, first of all, I'll share a picture of the book cover, because on the book cover, you may have noticed, is a picture of the Annunciation, of the appearance of the angel Gabriel to Mary. This picture actually goes back to the 13th century. It's a very early Renaissance Italian picture by Simone Martini. This just happens to be my favorite Annunciation picture, but the Annunciation is, for me, a very strongly archetypal image. And it offers an encounter between, well, I suppose primarily it's about what I would call the God archetype in the form of the angel, who is offering something very surprising, something beyond our normal understanding, something which could be very, very difficult to accept, but is sort of on the edge of what we can engage with. So Mary's uncertainty is obvious and reflects our own experience. But of course, Mary herself can also be archetypal. I think maybe a bit less so in this picture, but obviously Mary is often identified with the Animo archetype, and I'll say more about that later. Okay, so that's one picture just to get going. Another picture just to start us off a bit. So this is a picture, this appears also in my book. So this is Gustave Doré, an illustration from Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, of the fall of Satan. So yeah, the archetype of the shadow is often represented for people by Satan. And here's the idea, well, graphically illustrated, the way in which the shadow is something we reject. And heaven has rejected Satan because of his arrogance and sin and so on. So, yeah, but there are obviously many other ways of depicting the shadow. This is just one of them. Another image. Yeah, from the life of the Buddha. Again, this appears in my book. So the Buddha's life story, the early life story of the Buddha, includes him traditionally being born into a palace, going forth from that into the forest, being taught by 2 different teachers, and then falling in with 5 ascetics who commit austerities, who subject themselves to pain, in fact, in order to try and gain merit or good karma by the process. But the Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, as he was at that point, realizes the limitations of asceticism, that he's not actually going to progress in that way. It's not actually helpful to him. So this picture depicts him walking away from the ascetics. It's a rather graphic picture, but there's something heroic about this. The Buddha goes through these 2 processes of going forth, of going beyond, of exerting difficult effort in order to find a better way, which is the difficulty we all have in doing something difficult. But of course, the Buddha also then, by that, gains a status, which, again, I'll say later about why I would identify that with what might be called the God archetype as well. Then another, it's probably the final. Okay, so this is a picture of Xi Wangmu, who is a Chinese goddess. Again, this appears in the book. This is an interesting Animo image. So this is a goddess who is lives on a wild mountain. Is very unpredictable, rather difficult to tame. Rides a tiger, which again suggests this. She's part of the Chinese pantheon. And at one time, the sort of religious authorities in China tried to get her a consort, but the ordinary people wouldn't accept this. You know, she wasn't the kind of figure who could have a consort or be tamed by domestic life of any kind. So she's the untamable, mysterious anima, you could say, from a Chinese point of view. But again, showing you a Chinese image suggests, you know, how widely the cultural differences, how widely archetypes appear in different cultures. Okay, so that's just a few images to warm up, but basically, yeah, the main point of just talking about these images is that they're examples of ways in which archetypes can be meaningful for individuals, of what we mean by archetypal. You know, archetypes are not necessarily images, but they can appear as images. They can also appear in stories, just as ideas, or even as concepts, I think. But the meaning and the value of these archetypal symbols is evidently shared. I mean, that's the obviously the thing that Jung suggested in his idea of the collective unconscious. That was his way of trying to explain the universality of archetypes and the effect that they have on us. I would just say that they are evidently shared, something to do with our human status, our human makeup, enables us to need archetypes. It's not that the archetypes all mean the same to all of us. So a picture of Xi Wangmu may not mean much to you, but it meant something traditionally in China. So the archetype depends on us as well as on the picture itself or on the image itself. But the need, the relationship that we have with archetypal symbols appears to be something universal. So why are these archetypal symbols important, and why did I want to write about them? Well, they are central, I think, to the meaning of human life, especially, but not only, in religion. So religion provides a particularly concentrated form. But the book is called Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, which obviously reflects my design not to be limited by what people formally see as religion or religious. Archetypes are central to why people engage with religion, I think, so particularly how it can help them, but also how it can hinder them. So there's a distinction to be made there, which depends on archetypes. So that's why I see archetypes and understanding archetypes as crucial to a balanced critique of religion, of trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. What's helpful or unhelpful in religious traditions. But archetypes don't actually seem to be discussed. Well, obviously Jungians do discuss them, but in the wider population, archetypes don't seem to be discussed that much in relation to religion. For example, I don't find scholars of religious studies discussing them very much, or theologians and people like that. And the critics of religion, the Richard Dawkinses and Sam Harrises and so on, again, don't seem to talk about them. Archetypes often seem to be ignored or misunderstood by critics of religion. So all of this is part of the background to why I think it's important to talk about archetypes in religion and beyond. Now, what I was setting out to do in the book is to offer a practical view of archetypes. That is an approach to them which begins with the questions like, what do archetypes do? How do archetypes affect us? How do we practice with them? So what do we do in response to them? Or what is it helpful for us to do in response to them? That may mean bracketing questions about, well, what are archetypes ultimately? So sometimes I've started discussions about archetypes and people have sometimes responded with things like, well, I'm not sure archetypes exist. And that's a very strange answer to me, because it's not about whether they exist. We experience things that we can call archetypal. So what we have to do primarily is to clarify what we mean and how we're going to respond to what we experience. So I'm looking for a practically helpful way of understanding archetypes. Now, by practical, perhaps I should clarify that I'm talking about quite a wide range of practice by individuals, particularly, but also conceivably at the social level. I'm not especially talking about therapeutic practice. So maybe some of you from a more psychotherapeutic background may be thinking in those terms. But I'm not a therapist. I come from more of a philosophical background. But obviously therapy has its place, I think, in the range of practices that human beings can engage in, helpful practices. Yeah, in the process of trying to develop a practical approach to archetypes, then I have let go of some of the theoretical constructs that people have often taken to be necessary, particularly Jung himself seems to have taken as necessary to the explanation of archetypes. Particularly there, I'm talking about the idea of the collective unconscious, and also particularly Jung's use of Platonic ideas, the idea of the Platonic idea, or eros. Now, I'm not going to focus on that particularly. There are chapters on it in my book, but the book is not primarily a critique of Jung. It's just it's focusing positively on a practical view of what archetypes can be in practice. But by the by, I felt some explanation was needed as to why I wasn't basing it on these traditional Jungian ways of talking about archetypes. And the basic reason is that I think they get in the way. So the account of archetypes that I've arrived at, I think, is compatible with a range of evidence, which is cited in the book. And I'm not just talking about evidence from Jungian psychology, I'm talking about a range of evidence, particularly from, say, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, quite a wide range of systems theory, quite a wide range of possible approaches. I also think it's potentially testable. Again, I'm not going to say a lot about that, and it's not my role to try and test it, because again, I'm not an empirically trained scientist, but it might be possible for others to test what I'm putting forward scientifically, I think. What I was aiming to do was to not only put forward, obviously, a practical sort of functional view of archetypes, but also to do full justice to the depth and importance of archetypal meaning and to the experiences that people have that they call archetypal. So although my approach is functional, it's in no way reductive. So I'm not, at any point, there's no just involved. I'm not saying archetypes are just this or just that. Not pretending to have a final view of what they are, which is totally valid or true or anything like that, which is what reductionism consists in, I think. Okay, so that's a few preliminaries, but now let me try now to get more to the heart of what my account of archetypes is, what I think they are. And I'll try and explain that by showing you another picture, which might help. Well, it's a diagram, actually. I'm just going to talk through this. It hopefully can provide you with a point of departure, which will help you to get your bearings in the explanation. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm not using the traditional Jungian way of explaining archetypes, which is that they are come from the collective unconscious, as Jungians call it. Now, that may seem peculiar to many people. What are archetypes if they're not unconscious? But the question I ask myself is, what's our experience? That's the question I ask myself about any practice, actually, because practice is about experience and about responding and dealing with experience. Unconscious, things that are judged to be unconscious, we only know about or claim to know about because we experience them at other times. So if something's unconscious, obviously you don't know about it. It's not experienced. So what's practically valuable about the unconscious that Jung talked about seems to me to be captured much more by the idea of conflict over time. So at one time we may have one view, and at another time we may have another view. A lot of the discussion of the unconscious in Jung and also in Freud talks, for example, about dreams, about fantasies, where we encounter the unconscious. But obviously, we encounter these symbols in a dream at one time, another time we don't. We have other kinds of experiences. So what makes them unconscious is a separation over time, if you like. And what particularly distances us from the unconscious is a conflict. The idea particularly, which again is found in Freud and Jung, of repression, that is, of not accepting things that we thrust down, as it were, into the unconscious. So conflict, repression is another word for conflict, internal conflict. So for examples of conflict over time, well, think about, for example, state of addiction. So maybe you're addicted to cigarettes. You keep wanting cigarettes, so a lot of your most common experience is a craving for nicotine, say, and the use of cigarettes. But then at another time, you feel sick. You don't want to smoke. You realize all the defects, the drawbacks of smoking, so you want to give up. But then the craving for nicotine comes back. Yeah, so in that state of addiction, you're in a state of conflict. You're moving at different times between different priorities. You're not consistent. It's a conflict over time. And we're all like that to some extent about some things, whether it's addiction or whether it's loss of memory, not keeping up with your friends. There are all kinds of ways in which we zoom in and out of different sorts of states with different priorities. We don't maintain the same priorities all the time. Sometimes that's not particularly a problem. However, conditions do change. So we're getting onto the second line of the diagram there. So when conditions change, we need new strategies to respond to the new conditions. So perhaps a particular set of priorities is no longer appropriate in new circumstances. We need to change our direction. But if we can't adapt ourselves, then the recognition of those new conditions and of the need to change conflicts with the old patterns. So, as in the example I just gave of smoking, yes. So you become aware of the health problems created by smoking. You want to give up, but you can't do it. So you're in a state of conflict. Now, differences over time then are the crucial idea here, which I think lies behind why archetypes are necessary. So going on to the second box, we have these conflicts over time, and we have developed an adaptive process for addressing those conflicts. And I call that adaptive process archetypal function. So if we are inconsistent, if we can't maintain our intentions and our sources of inspiration, then we need reminders. Where are those reminders going to come from? Well, they're going to come from experiences that are meaningful to us, which particularly prompt us and motivate us towards what we need to engage with, so the things which are better for us in the longer term. I'm also adopting here the embodied meaning approach, which is very central to my whole approach to archetypes. So embodied meaning is the approach to meaning which you'll find particularly in, well, increasingly a wide range of thinkers, but George Lakoff and Mark Johnson are particularly the figures that have influenced me here. So embodied meaning is an account of why symbols of all kinds, so not only words, but also images, any kind of symbol is meaningful to us. It's meaningful to us because of association based on our experience, our active experience as embodied beings. So things are meaningful to us because we develop associations with them over time. And that's an explanation not just of so-called emotive meaning, but also of cognitive meaning, that the two are not different from each other. So this kind of embodied meaning is where archetypal symbols, well, archetypal symbols are examples of associative embodied meaning. So our adaptation to the problem of being conflicted and inconsistent is regular associative reminders of how we need to be different. So the image there of a Superman or Supergirl or whatever is just an example of an archetype of the hero. So a heroic archetype, for example, might remind us of the need to persevere, of the need to continue despite difficulties when we might otherwise give up. And imagine a child, for example, who is inspired by Harry Potter. He's deeply into that story. And the child's struggling with some homework, and then maybe the child recalls Harry Potter, gets a sense, it could be a very implicit sense, but a sense of how Harry Potter would approach this. So it makes a difference to the child. The child can be inspired by the experience of association with what Harry Potter means to that child. So archetypal function can work in all kinds of ways. I think I've just given you an example of how it can help us work towards a goal, but it can also help us in our relationships. It can help us to avoid threats, and it can help us to engage with potentials, unknown, mysterious potentials, possibilities, new possibilities. Okay, so that's, there's much more, obviously, I could say there, which maybe some of it I'll come back to about what archetypal symbols, what forms they could take and so on. But to get the overall picture, let's go on to the third box. So this adaptive process, this archetypal function, well, you know, it might work to inspire us, to help us develop, help us make better judgments, but it can get hijacked, and it gets hijacked by projection. And projection I see as a shortcut. So rather than go through the full difficulties of using the archetype to do something difficult, we start to use the sort of substitute for the archetype, an easier version of it, in order to get something quick, in order to make things easier. In the process, we stop that adaptive process, so it no longer works properly. The archetype no longer functions for us properly because we projected it. So that's what happens when what started off as a meaningful experience, prompting us to maybe to continue towards our goals, or to engage with our relationships, or to engage with some new potential. That meaning instead becomes a belief. What's more, it becomes an absolute belief. So it's a belief about the whole of the object bearing the archetype. So supposing it's a person who inspires you, maybe it's a person who's rather different from you, maybe the opposite sex, has characteristics that help you to compensate for your own limitations. Yeah. So supposing you're a rather macho man and you're inspired by your partner who is a rather kindly or feminine woman. But if you only, if you imagine that, or you assume rather, that that's all there is to her, then you begin to turn that that archetypal relationship into a projection, a belief that that's all there is to her, that the object bearing the archetype, that is in this case the woman, is just this idealized femininity. And of course, you might not notice then her faults, the difficulties, and also the way in which she has quite different needs of her own, which might not fit in with your archetypal needs. The people are complicated. So projection has all kinds of negative effects on us, whether it's in a relationship or whether we're projecting heroism onto ourselves, onto our business, which will work regardless of all the difficult conditions, and we head for failure because of that. Or most profoundly, I think the projection of God, so the turning of God as a meaningful archetype into a belief in a supernatural being. Again, I think that's a hijacking of the archetype, turning it into a projection. On the diagram there, I've also put reinforcing feedback loops of projection. So projection also fits into the idea of reinforcing feedback loops. That is, that every time we engage in the projection, it reinforces itself. We keep seeing the person in that way. Maybe we interact with them as though they were the projection. And that's, again, strengthens our view that that's all there is to them. Okay, so projection is, there's a whole section about projection and the exploration of what projection is in my book. I don't think that it's just about seeing something that isn't there. I think that's an inadequate account of projection. So, or that it's not just about the fact that we have an input into what we perceive. So I prefer to describe it in the ways I just have. That is, that we develop a belief about an object and we think that the archetype is all there is to that object. Okay, so projection prevents archetypes from working properly, but we can still do something about that. So projection, the final box, projection can be overcome by integration. So integration can be supported by a range of practices, which you could call integrative practices, also sometimes called spiritual practices. And what such practices do overall is put the projection in a bigger context, so that we see that the archetype is the archetypal function is not all there is to the person. There's bigger complexity there. There's more to this object. So we bring together different possible views from our experience. We stop blocking some of them out. We get a bigger view, and we're motivated to maintain a bigger view of what we have previously projected. The picture at the bottom there is of the two mules. This is from a set of pictures I often use, which is the two mules who are pulling in different directions, trying to eat different piles of hay. There's a rope tying them together. They get into conflict because, obviously, their desires to eat different piles of hay are incompatible. But in the two mules pictures, there's a moment of reflection. The mules are so frustrated by the situation that eventually they have to reconsider, and they recognize that, oh, well, actually, we could do this differently. And then the final pictures show them eating one pile of hay together and then going over to the other one. So it's a moment of integration. They've overcome the conflict which previously blocked them, and they've overcome the assumption that eating that pile of hay is all they could do. And you could also say they've overcome their heroic projection, because they had very strong goals, each of them, to eat that pile of hay, which they were devoted to. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of some key ideas in the book. I appreciate that it's probably way too fast to get hold of very deeply. Such is the nature of a talk like this about a complex book. But hopefully it will give you a taste of what it's about. Let me just see if there's anything else I should mention. Yeah, so maybe I can just say a little bit more about how this hangs together before I finish my talk. So basically, my view of archetypes is that they are functions. They provide long-term inspiration. They do that through embodied association, which I mentioned. And that depends on experience built up in our bodies in relation to symbols. Those symbols operate for us as archetypal symbols. Now, whether a symbol is archetypal, of course, there's a big cultural input into that. It depends on what that symbol has come to mean to us. And the symbol could be a picture, could be an image, could be words, could just be an idea. Could be a person, of course, the idea of a person. The definition of archetypes, which I introduce in the introduction of my book, sounds a bit technical, but what it does is bring together the ideas of the embodied meaning in archetypes and the idea that we come back to them over time. So I describe them as diachronic schematic functions. They're functions, they work in a particular way for us. They're schematic, which means they provide a focus of associated meaning for us. And they're diachronic, which means that they operate over time, and that's central to how they work for us. So they give us inspiration over time. We keep coming back to them and gaining a sort of motivation from them. So as I also mentioned, that are abstract beliefs about archetypal symbols, where they're often projected onto those the objects of those symbols. Archetypes are not about beliefs about objects. They make, at best, they make no difference to their functioning, and at worst, they can interfere with it through projection. So that would mean, for example, that the meaningfulness of God as an archetype is what makes God operate as an archetypal symbol, regardless of whether you believe in God or not. The belief, I would argue, is irrelevant to the way in which God works for us. And so there's a key point in the way in which archetypes can help us develop a helpful critique of religion, I think. Okay, so there are 4 archetypal functions which I've effectively already mentioned. The inspiration provided for pursuing goals, the inspiration for relationships, the inspiration for our response to threats, and the inspiration to wider potentiality. So those 4 archetypal functions can also be related to 4 archetypes, which happen to be ones that Jung often talked about as 4 crucial archetypes. So the goals are to do with the hero archetype, relationships are to do with the Animo Animus, response to threats is to do with the shadow, and the wider potentiality is the God archetype. Okay, and I've already talked about projection interfering with that, where it can interfere with any of those archetypal functions, and the ways in which integration can address that. Okay, so just to close then with some of the distinctive features of this account, yes. So how this is different from accounts of archetypes, which personally that I've seen anyway before. So they make use of an embodied basis of meaning, as I mentioned, from Lecoff and Johnson particularly, and follow that through consistently. They make a distinction between meaning and belief, which I think is incredibly important, but not widely used. They work with phenomenal evidence for the unconscious, with what we experience, rather than any beliefs about the unconscious as such. They make a distinction between archetypes as functions and the symbols that fulfill those functions. So quite often, I think archetypes get confused with symbols. Obviously, there are archetypal symbols, that is, symbols have an archetypal function for us. But the symbols themselves are not archetypes. So if, for example, you sort of categorize symbols according to what they look like or what categories they're in, I don't think you're classifying archetypes. So that's why I would talk about, for example, the Animo Animus and the God and hero functions, rather than say the mother archetype or the trickster or the magician. You know, there are various other archetypes which are often discussed by Jungians, but I think the functions of those other archetypes fall into those four key ones, four functional archetypes. So the classification of archetypes there is based on their functions, not on the type of symbol. Another distinctive feature of my account is that projection is based on the disruption of that function. So archetypes not working for us properly, not on failing to see the reality of the object in some way, which I think doesn't tell us anything decisive. And finally, my approach shows the relationship between quite a wide range of practices and the helpful functioning of archetypes. So if you want to think about how archetypes can be helpful to a whole load of practices, for example, mindfulness, the arts, and critical thinking. Those are three particular kinds of practice that I tend to emphasize. And also how the effective use of archetypes needs those kinds of practices. Yeah, that's what I'm aiming to show. So we need to be able to spot projection and work to avoid projection, which means we need integrative practices to help maintain archetypes performing their functions for us. Okay, I better stop there. So obviously that's been very compressed, but I've tried to give you some of the key ideas in the book. Hopefully it's been comprehensible to some extent, but I'm open to questions from this point.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think, sorry, who's speaking?
Edward.
Edward, oh, hi, Edward, yep.
You want to go, Jill? I'll wait for you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I always find it very hard. And just at the end, I thought of the Z that Russians are using. And I thought I'd ask you to tell me whether that fits being an archetype. And if it doesn't, can you go through the 4 bits and say, no. But I mean, I kept on thinking, oh, a bit of an archetype there, you know, bit of past history going forward, helpfully. So talk me through it.
So you started with.
Tell me whether the Russians that are using Z in Ukraine, whether you could see that as an archetype.
Okay, well, that depends to whom. So to me or to you or to any other people or to the Russians. So you're asking, is that a Z an archetype? Yeah?
It's the Russians who are using it, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so
is that Z an archetype?
Probably. Well, for the Russians, for the patriotic Russians who support Putin, I would say it appears to be a heroic archetypal symbol. It's motivating them, it's reminding them of their endeavor to overcome difficulties with it. To us, though, or to me, certainly, it's more of a shadow symbol. It's reminds me of a threat. Yeah, obviously the archetypal function is not fixed by the nature of the symbol. It depends on the person, not only what their cultural context, but also their psychological states and so on in relation to that symbol. Does that make sense?
I was watching Lynn struggling. She didn't very pleased with that answer.
Well, the Z is for Zelensky, and it's Russians who don't support Putin, as I understand it, unless I'm mistaken. So it would be a heroic emblem, a symbol, and you could call it conjuring up the archetype of the hero.
Okay, well, obviously we have different understandings then of how that Z is being used in Russia at the moment. But if you're correct, then that sounds fine. Yeah, if that's what the Z means to people, then it's, yeah, it could be a heroic archetype for those people. Do you want to come in with a question then?
Yes, I lost concentration when you listed the 4 main types of archetype in your thinking. Could you just reiterate that, please?
Okay, so the first one is the hero, right? So the hero is concerned with goals and persevering in goals. As the hero gets more subtle, those goals may change and our ways of trying to reach them may change. Second one is the shadow. So the shadow is concerned with threats and the avoidance of threats. So it inspires us to maintain our engagement with avoiding threats. Very often, however, those threats are projected. So we don't actually identify things that are really threats, and we get, we react to things that aren't really threatening us. Okay, so then the third one is the Animo Animus. So that I would describe as the archetype of the attractive other. So again, this is a feature of my functional approach that I don't think it's essentially about sex or gender. I think it's about responding to what we find attractively other in relationship with it. And then the final one is the God Archetype, which is the overall archetype of mysterious potentiality, particularly associated with religious experience. So wider experience of what's beyond our grasp or on the edge of what we can engage with. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
I have quite a number of questions and comments, but I'll limit it to one for the moment.
Okay, Edward.
The middle way is something associated with Madhyamaka Buddhism. So do you discuss any of that kind of Buddhism and its practices in your book in terms of using archetypes properly?
There is some discussion of archetypes in Buddhism, yes, including Mahayana Buddhism. There isn't particularly any discussion of the Madhyamaka in this book, no. But there's more discussion of the middle way in Buddhism in my book, The Buddha's Middle Way, which is much more focused on that kind of issue. But the middle way, as I've been trying to develop it, is not just the Buddhist account of the middle way. It's obviously inspired by the Buddhist account of the middle way in some ways, but it's trying to develop a more universal account of the middle way, which can be applied in all sorts of contexts. And it's particularly about judgment. The judgment that allows us to avoid absolutes or projections on either side. So this book is also about the middle way in that sense. So because its discussion of projections is linked to the avoidance of absolutes, both positive and negative, on either side in the middle way. So Madhyamaka does have some examples of that, I would say, but I wouldn't accept the Madhyamaka account as being a total account of the middle way in the universal sense. Lee, do you want to come in?
I think someone else was also raising their hand. Lenny, maybe? Before me?
Oh, yes.
It's
Well,
okay,
I'll come to
You go ahead, Lee.
Okay.
I'll come back to Lenny. Yeah. Go on, Lee.
Yeah, I was wondering with these 4 categories, if like other things, like other, I mean, for example, I don't know, I've sometimes used these, I don't know if you would call them archetypes or what is the definition, but like, for example, characters sort of that represent a some type of mental state that you want to achieve more, or that you feel like maybe you're going too extreme in the other direction. For me, I would say maybe I was being like most of the time too agitated and want, for example, more relaxed one, then I imagine some type of chill monk or something like that. And this is like these kind of images that pop in your head when you try to make this mental state happen. Then do you think these are also archetypes, or because I'm not sure where that would fit in these categories that you just said?
Okay, I mean, they sound like associative symbols, but perhaps not archetypal ones. I don't know. Depends very much how you use them. So if you're using them to inspire you, to recapture perhaps a state that you've had in the past, then they might start to have an archetypal function.
Okay.
So association with your experience, I think, is important, as well as, you know, all the cultural symbols and so on that we might have that help us to associate meaning with symbols. But yeah, this is particularly important, I think, with the God archetype. So why does God have this incredibly immense open meaning for people? And a lot of that is to do with religious experience, I think, or, you know, which is a wide-ranging idea, the concept of religious experience. But it could be a relatively minor experience. It could be some major life-changing experience. But for somebody who's had that kind of experience, quite often God or some other symbol of the God archetype can remind us of it and re-inspire us with it. So yeah, whatever the experience, particularly if that experience is helpful to you in some way, you know, it's very likely that if a symbol captures an experience or reminds you of an experience, then it might well have an archetypal function.
Okay.
Lenny.
Hi, yes. While you were talking about those 4 different categories, what came into my head, I found myself trying to make sense of, again, current ongoing scenario of the war in Ukraine, and thinking about Putin and where he would fit in the archetypes, and maybe maybe a different one for representing different people. So maybe he's trying, maybe in his own eyes he's being the hero, and maybe to some Russian people he is, and whereas obviously to the Ukrainians and also perhaps to some Russians and the rest of us, he's more being the threat archetype. Or maybe there's even more. I don't know if there's a case for the Animus or God in there as well, but I just found it quite interesting to try, because I think ever since this horrendous war started, I keep finding my poor old mind trying to make sense of it, and eventually I exhaust myself and think, you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And so actually it just struck me that in that way of sort of looking at the situation, and particularly him as the instigator, if you sort of put him in those different archetypal roles, then it does sort of make sense a bit.
Yeah, well, it explains people's response. Yeah, but I mean, the problem is, I suppose, with Putin, he actually is a threat at the moment. There's a lot of evidence that he's actually threatening us in a very serious way. Certainly the people of Ukraine. So the difficulty is disentangling the actual threat from the projection. But we could do that by recollecting the complexity of Putin himself as a character. You know, that imagine him doing something innocent like walking in the country or something. You know, that there's more to him than just the person who made those judgments to launch an invasion of Ukraine and continue it. But those judgments seem to me to be based on quite often classically threatening sort of evil judgments. You know, so the idea, the shadow, or the archetype of evil is in some ways includes a helpful reminder to us of aspects of human character that can create threats. So cruelty, for example, or megalomania, or deception. You know, so from what I know of Putin, a lot of those triggers, as it were, do seem to be accurate. So we have to be aware both that we're kind of triggered, our ideas of evil are triggered by his character, as well as that there's more to him than just those triggers.
Thank you. So I'm now wondering whether there's any hope of kind of integrating those different influences within him to sort of try and bring things into some sort of better balance.
Well, I mean, within him, obviously, for him, there's a difficulty that only he can deal with. But all we can do is try and avoid projection as far as we can, despite all the provocations, as it were. Okay.
Yeah, which in a way was what Zelensky was trying to do in the beginning before it started, because he saw that they were trying to provoke a response, and he very wisely chose not, you know, had his forces ordering not to retaliate, because he realized that that's what was wanted by Putin, to give him then a seemingly legitimate excuse to invade. But because he didn't in the end, I mean, although he still invaded, at least he could in no way say it was provoked by any military action from the Ukrainians. Anyway, thank you. That was interesting to explore a bit.
Okay. Jill, you've got another question.
I was pleased to know that you could look at the Z in two ways. You know, you said at the beginning, either from the Russian point of view or the Ukrainian. And watching those young men doing the Z, I found very frightening, almost like the Maoris doing their chant at rugby matches. You know, you frighten the people for. And I didn't properly understand how the Ukrainians could take it on as a good sign. I mean, in a way, there's not an awful lot perhaps we can do about Putin, but how that Z frightens us, or frightened me, perhaps, you know, I'd like to know more about how I can take it on board and use it sort of positively.
I think Lynn wants to come in there.
Did you pick up that I said that I thought the Z represented the initial for Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader?
Oh, right. That's easy, isn't it?
I think so.
Clever thinking.
Can I ask a different question on a slightly different tack? I'm intrigued by your talking about the archetype of God, and you talk about experience being, well, it's a touchstone of your thinking, really, about embodied experience, and yet it sounds like you acknowledge that some people have an experience of God and some people don't. Is that right?
I think nearly everybody has religious experience to some degree, because I see it very much as a matter of degree. But the thing is that we're so used to talking about experience of God in connection with the supernatural belief in God. But I would want to separate the two. So I think we can have religious experience without necessarily having a belief that this experience is created by a supernatural God. And the other thing, though, is that in no way reduces the importance and significance and meaningfulness of that archetypal experience. It's just as strong as it was before, even if you stop believing it comes from an absolute, eternal, infinite being, etc. I mean, there are lots of difficulties with that, I think, from the sort of all the cultural assumptions that were sort of entrenched in the way that people often talk about religion. But there's just this really unhelpful assumption that there must be this necessary association between the meaning of God and the belief in God. But I think it's central to separate meaning from belief in general, and that's just one example of it.
When you talk about belief, are you implying the sort of construct of institutionalized religion? Is that what you're
in the case of belief in, well, there's three possible things we could talk about here. So there's belief in general. Yes, so I could believe it's going to rain tomorrow. That's a belief. But there's specific absolute beliefs, like the belief that God exists. So I think absolute beliefs are much more likely to be projections, because they go beyond what we can experience. So they're obviously not looking at the whole context of what we've experienced, I would say. Yeah, sorry, could you remind me of the last bit of your question? There was another point you made, wasn't there?
Well, I think you're helping. I was wondering if you were just rejecting the trappings of institutionalized religion. But I will say that it is possible to feel that you experience God, that one experiences God, I should say, speaking personally, and very much not as something out there, but as something within that is really not me or my ego, with which I can have a relationship that develops. But is that consistent with your thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the belief in God is not necessarily about institutionalized religion. You could have an absolute belief in God without that, conceivably. And there are all sorts of other, I think, absolutizations of the God archetype, which aren't necessarily religious. So people can absolutize nature or truth or whatever. And I think that's another version of it. But in terms of, having an inner God, then I think that depends very much on what you attach to that inner experience of God, and very much what you deduce from it. So sometimes people can have a kind of intuitive experience that they might call God, which they don't, they think is spiritual rather than religious, that they don't associate with particular dogmas or whatever. But they can still sometimes use it as a kind of revelatory source of information that they then use to deduce other things. So for example, the belief that God told them, well, in some extreme cases, God told them to go and kill people, or there was a case in Britain of a a rapist called the Yorkshire Ripper, who believed that God told him to go out and kill prostitutes. Yeah, so he had this experience, which wasn't obviously institutional religion. It was his inner voice, if you like, but he still used that in a dogmatic way, in an absolute way. So he formed a belief by over-interpreting that meaningful experience, perhaps. Okay, Edward, do you want to come back?
You had briefly mentioned 3 techniques that we can use to differentiate the third from the fourth step, from the projection or idealization to the integration of the archetypes in a functional way. You had mentioned critical thinking, you had mentioned mindfulness meditation. There was a third, and I'd like you to say a little bit more about these 3 techniques and how you can tell the difference between your projection and your functional integration and use of archetypes.
Yeah, again, there's a lot we could say about this, but reasonably briefly, I would see integrative practice in general as providing context for things we would otherwise project or take absolutely. So when we take something absolutely or we project it, we think that's the whole story. We assume that what we believe about what we've experienced is the only way you can interpret it, that's all it is. That's the truth of the matter. So integrative practices prompt us to take a wider view of it. They introduce other possibilities. And there are basically, I think, 3 different ways they can operate. One of them is by putting us in a more relaxed, open state where we're more likely to be open to new possibilities. So that's mindfulness is an example of that. Yeah. So, but there are a number of other practices that could also do that, but that work with our state of mind at the moment. So that's one type. Then the second type, I think, provides a context of meaning. So it provides us with new possible ways of understanding things, new possible symbols to use in understanding things. So the arts, I think, are a good example of that. Whether you're practicing the arts by creating things or whether you're appreciating art, either of those can help us to put things in a bigger meaning context. So the first one was to do more with body and direct experience context. The second is more meaning context. The third one is more about belief context or intellectual context. So critical thinking, I think, is very much the skill of seeing our assumptions in a bigger context. So we become aware that our assumptions are not the whole story, that there are other possible arguments that could be made, other possible views that could be justified about a particular issue, and then also, of course, weighing up the justification of those different views. So we might carry on believing what we believed in the first place if we find it to be justified, but we look at the evidence, we look at how our experience or other sources of information support the view we had. Those are the 3 general areas, I think, of integrative practice that and again, there's a whole list of possible practices I could talk about, but I'm not going to go through them all. But mindfulness is a good example of a more immediate practice that works with our bodies and immediate experience. The arts are an example of one that works with meaning and our stock of symbols that we can draw on and our range of understanding. And critical thinking is a general term for the skill of seeing our beliefs in context. Is that helpful, Edward? Any other questions on that?
Yes, just a comment. You talked about Lakoff and Johnson, which
Lakoff
I
and Johnson, yep.
studied them extensively, and in terms of seeing a variety of different views, their cognitive science basically says that the image schema that we use, our embodied image schema, the way we categorize and interpret the world, are various and different, that we extend through metaphor. And they claim that one of the mistakes that philosophers make is attaching to a particular metaphor or blend of metaphors and assuming that's all there is to the story. Yeah. Whereas if you take different metaphors, you get a different story. So they're like a pluralistic way of looking at it. And these different ways of looking at it are maybe meaningful in themselves, but they are not consistent with other ways of looking at things. So in other words, there is no one absolute way to look at things. Yeah. To project the absolute. So their way of looking at it through cognitive science is that there's many ways to interpret. Some are better and some are worse, but there is no one overriding absolute way to interpret anything.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I mean, they reveal particularly how there's a variety of cognitive models, a variety of metaphors that can be used, which give us different sources of meaning. So the arts are just one illustration of, I mean, education generally is another sort of practice which can give us a wide range of understanding in which to put things in a bigger context. Lee, do you want to come in there? You're muted, Lee. At least I can't hear you.
Headphones. I think Jill was before me.
I've talked quite a lot. You have a go.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering because we were talking about the arts, and I feel like sometimes that, at least like for the younger people, maybe in Western societies, religion is maybe less prevalent, and so maybe they have replaced it a bit with arts in the way, like stories and books. And
sorry, I can't hear you very well, Lee. Could you perhaps get closer to your mic or speak louder?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking about, because I mean, religion is not super prevalent anymore, like in the West, among my generation, for example. So, and I feel like they're using more like stories as in books and movies. And I don't know, I've seen a lot of these, or watch these for fun, like for example, critics of movies and so on, because I'm interested in writing. And I see sometimes they're commenting on that modern movies are, or like these like opinion piece sort of modern movies are destroying the heroes or so. And there they talk about the fact that there seems to be the trend of deconstruction of archetypes in some sense. So where they say, okay, like for example, the hero actually is an alcoholic now or something, like 10 years later, and these kind of things, that this is very common nowadays. And I was wondering if that has to do with, if that's sort of maybe a reaction to projection or something, or something like that. I don't know, because I felt that that's a bit sad as well when you watch these things and you're like, okay, you can't just throw it out completely, That's also very sad.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, and it's one that's discussed in my book as well. So what I would call reactive projection. So in response to finding that we projected something, that we've taken an object to just be about the archetype, we've got fixated on certain beliefs about the object or person, we could take the opposite reactive view, which is assuming that the archetype is not present in that person or that object at all, and that might involve, decrying the archetype in general, not trying to engage with the archetype, or believing that the archetype is of no value anymore. So because there's no hero, there's nothing worth trying to achieve anything, you know, that sort of view. Yeah, that I think you know, you do find that in sort of naive critique or criticism, which is focuses on a negative absolute rather than a balanced critique of a projection of some kind, or an absolutization. So that's central to the idea of the middle way. Is you know, avoiding those reactive negative absolute views as well as the positive ones. So another example of that will be avoiding atheism in the sense of belief in the non-existence of God, as well as avoiding belief in the existence of God. Because belief in the non-existence of God can be just as absolute and devout, as you'll probably be aware. George.
Hi there, thanks very much. Been enjoying this evening.
Can you get a bit louder, George?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yep. I was just interested when you're talking about the archetype about relationships, which you call the animus and anima, which I know is from Jung, and you said that you're not seeing it as a kind of a sexual attraction necessarily, and I just wondered why you used those two names for it if it doesn't have a male and a female dynamic to it, as it were.
Right. Well, I think it often does. It's just that it's not sort of the essential definition of it. So I guess that's why I continue to use Animo Animus. But it's really continuity with the terms used by Jung. And I did think actually the other day, should I have used a different term? But anyway, it's too late now. Okay. So, an alternative possible label might be the archetype of the attractive other or something like that. But that might be a bit cumbersome. Okay.
Thank you.
But obviously, we do often, the attractive other is often sexually related in some way or another. It's just that the attractive other could be something we find attractive in other ways. So you can have an alluring landscape. You could have an alluring animal, which is attractively other, for instance. And then there's the whole LGBTQ kind of thing that that Jung really didn't take into account, that there were other kinds of sexualities and other ways of finding others attractive, which are not just about male and female relationships. Okay, Jill, you've been very patient. Do you want to come back?
It's funny because in a way, I have a thought, and then other people talk, and I'm sort of thinking, it's an unconscious to this. Is my thought still going to be as relevant now at the end after 2 or 3 people? The original thought was, I am a non-theist Quaker, so I believe that God is in us. That's all that God is. But I have been very much a theist Quaker, and I've been very hard pushed to make sense of Christianity, which I think is pretty impressive, in a non-theist sort of way. So your very first picture, the Annunciation, I think I was in the National Gallery and I saw yet another depiction of the Annunciation. And I suddenly thought, so there we've got art and then time. I suddenly thought, 2,000 years ago, had those young women got a clue about sex? No, of course they didn't. Because nowadays they all, the adolescents all talk, as it were, behind the bike shed. They all teach each other about, sex and all that carry on. And so I've been playing with the idea of, I reckon that's a sort of archetype, isn't it? In a way, the way in which people transfer understanding, and sex came up just now, about things, in as best they can, and as things have progressed, and we've even ended up with this poor young, not quite known, there's going to be a few trends, and it's beyond me to understand. I watch quite a lot of Quaker Zoom meetings for worship, and they've all got me and him and them and us, and that's beyond me to understand that. But I sort of wanted to share with you my delight of one very supernatural image being able to be converted into something that's understandable as a, as time passes, and it's still in a way true, how people share with each other these difficult ideas.
So, I mean, that image is one I personally find very inspiring, which is obviously why I use it. I used it on my.
So what do you make of it then?
Well, as I mentioned, it's the experience of Mary of having something bafflingly, mysteriously other, and that openness to it that she struggles to achieve, which you get a sense of in very often, at least in the best Annunciation pictures.
Which you don't see it as a supernatural phenomena. You
No.
don't really believe an angel came.
No, indeed. So that's where I'd separate meaning from belief. Yeah. So the picture is highly meaningful to me. I don't believe in God or angels or the Annunciation or the virgin birth or any of that stuff. But it's that doesn't lose any of its significance at all.
But what's the meaning then?
What's meaning?
What's the meaningfulness of it?
The meaningfulness, as I say, is the relationship, the associations I have, which have an archetypal function, with particularly with the God archetype, and the encounter with the God archetype, and the difficulties in engaging with this otherness, this mystery, this new potentiality beyond what we've identified with, and beyond what we've understood.
Like sex.
Sorry?
Basic human sex. Is that the unknown that she's just getting a little glimmer of?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, if that's what you get from it, then yes. I don't take the picture as being particularly about sex, but I mean, symbolically, yes, the fact that she's conceived is also about creativity and relationship between creativity and that mystery represented by the angel. But I don't think it's literally about sex, no. And obviously there's all kinds of stuff bundled up in the view of Mary as a virgin and so on, which are questionable. But we're running out of time, I think. But let's get Susan a quick question.
Just about that image, I really got it, that it's not about sex, it's about the divine is there, and it's like, whoops, I don't know about this. This is it's the ambivalence, especially for modern people who think critically. If they're faced with that awesomeness, it's something that they might be a little uncomfortable with. I mean, that's how I look at it. And I think that's how you look at it.
Indeed, yeah. Right. Just before we finish it, do you want to come in, Olivia? Because I think you had your hand up. You're muted.
I was about to say I'm going to have to go in a minute. So
okay, that's fair enough.
Bye to you, but
yeah,
very interesting. So thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Bye bye.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming or joining me. Obviously, yes, just one thing to flag up, if you're interested in further discussion of this topic, is that in the Middle Way Society, we are planning to explore it further in a series of Zoom meetings on the Middle Way network, particularly in relation to practice. So we haven't advertised that yet, but it will be advertised shortly, I think. And this will involve George as well as me. Yeah, if you look on the Middle Way Society site, if you sign up to the network, Middle Way Network, then you will get information about these new meetings, which are following through on the stuff I've been talking about.
You advertised on Facebook, which is where I saw you.
Yes, it probably will be on Facebook as well. Yeah. If you particularly if you join Middle Way Discussion or follow Middle Way Society on Facebook, then you'll get those announcements. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you
Nice.
very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.